I noticed this morning already that his first planned international visit is to the European Union. Not good. Not good. We don't have a trade war with the European Union today. We are in the midst of a trade war with the United States of America and China, the two largest economies in the world and our two largest export markets and trading partners.
A very good point from Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Mark Carney will be installed today as Canada's 24th Prime Minister. And what's on the agenda? Going to Europe. I wonder why. This is the guy who says he's more European than Canadian. But we have a guest today who will talk about what Mark Carney might be doing over in Europe, which is inserting himself into the Ukraine war and Canada's continued contribution to that war. And that's Dr. Jean-François Caron of the Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan. And we'll have him momentarily. Don't go away. We need. Look at the change. But we also need to resolve to resist.
It's not here.
Yes, thanks for joining us today and Stand on Guard. And it's my pleasure to have Dr. Jean-François Caron joining us today, and we're going to be talking about Ukraine largely, because I think that's probably the issue of the hour. Professor Caron, welcome to Stand on Guard. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And so I'm curious about Ukraine, and I heard you recently talk to Rebel News about your position on this, and I found it quite interesting the way you're describing the coalition of the good. And how they love the virtue signal about this, but why is it? I'll lead off with this because I've done a lot of study into this whole matter, and so many people think the war just started 3 years ago in 2022 when there was it was an illegal invasion of Ukraine. Yes, we'll say that it was improper, inappropriate. But the war didn't start in 2022, and I think you'd be amongst the first to say that this war goes back to at least 2014 when the United States installed a Ukrainian president who was friendly to them and not to Russia, and the calls came for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, which is something Russia just won't accommodate, just won't tolerate. So why is it so hard for people to understand that this is a very complex war? And it didn't just start in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Actually, I would say that this war started 100 years ago. At the collapse of the Russian Empire, at the beginning of the USSR, Ukraine, for a short period of time, had its own country, was an independent country, and then it was swallowed into the USSR. And people have been recalling that at the beginning of the 1930s, Stalin organizes a planned starvation. And among all the former Soviet republics, the Ukrainians were the ones who suffered the most. Hundreds of thousands of people in the course of only 18 months or 2 years died of starvation. So there was this feeling of resentment on the part of Ukrainians already in the 1930s. And when the Germans, the Nazis, invaded USSR in June 1941, well, you have a fraction of the Ukrainian nationalists who saw in the Germans some sort of potential allies, which is why many nationalist Ukrainians actively participated alongside the Germans, and they fought against the Soviet Union. And some people discovered this only a few months ago when the House of Commons welcomed this former combatant from the Ukrainian army who actually fought alongside the Germans during the Second World War. And even after the war, for a period of 10 years, you still had Ukrainian nationalists, especially in the western part of the country, who kept targeting Soviet officials. It ended only in the mid-1950s. So you've always had historically this resentment on the part of Ukrainians against Russia. And of course, in 1991, the collapse of Soviet Union, Ukraine was the first Soviet republic to announce its independence. And Ukraine has always been a buffer between the Eurasian world and Europe and the Western world. And from 1991 till 2004, it wasn't really a concern. But in 2004, the stakes started to increase, and you had the Orange Revolution, which was followed in 2014 by the Maidan Revolution. And this is kind of where everything started from a political perspective, because at that time, and this is what Vladimir Putin likes to recall, there was a third round in the presidential election. So Viktor Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian candidate, actually won the election, but you had the Maidan Revolution uprising, and which led to his departure from power, and this famous third round of the election, which led to the election of Petro Poroshenko, who was succeeded in 2019 by Volodymyr Zelensky. And then in 2014, as we know, Russia annexed Crimea and part of the Donbass region. But I mean, everything goes back to about 100 years. And in terms of NATO, this is what John Mersheimer, the famous American political scientist, has been recalling. The breaking point was 2008 at the summit of NATO in Bucharest, where NATO announced its intention to include in its organization Georgia and Ukraine. And everybody knows what happened in August 2008 when Georgia attacked the separatist region of Abkhazia and Ossetia. You had the Russian intervention, which only lasted a few days, and Georgia basically had to surrender, and these two republics became de facto independent. And so the Western world should have got the point, should have got the lesson at that point that it was going too far by trying to include in its organization, in its rank in NATO, these two former Soviet republics. But I mean, we've kept pushing, and the Maidan Square Revolution was seen by the Russians as a political coup, as an attempt on the part of the West to overthrow someone who had won the election fair and square, and to replace him with someone, Poroshenko, who was aiming to reorient the Ukrainian political system mostly towards the Western world. And for Vladimir Putin at that time, it was simply unacceptable to such a prospect was simply unacceptable, and this is why he annexed Crimea at that time.
Yeah, and in 1991, Gorbachev was essentially promised from George W. Bush downward, and Francois Mitterrand, Margaret Thatcher, all of these Western leaders promised Gorbachev that if he dissolved the Soviet Union, NATO would not go 1 inch eastward. In fact, that was the phrase they used, not 1 inch eastward. And of course, since then, it's almost doubled in size, and it's encroaching on Russian space now. The expectation that Ukraine could ever be a member. I mean, why was it unacceptable for Cuba to have Soviet missiles in 1962, but the United States, at least under Biden, I think it understands this under Trump, but most of Europe does not get this, and Canada under Trudeau did not get this, that Russia simply cannot tolerate a Ukraine that's not neutral. It cannot tolerate a Ukraine that might be a member of NATO, that might have nuclear weapons on the Russian border, because Poland has got nuclear weapons on the border. It's got weapons pointed right directly at Russia, and Russia had to make some statement about enough is enough on this. And certainly, as you've referenced, that there's a huge misunderstanding about what NATO is doing. I have to tell you, Professor, I served in the Canadian Air Force. I was deployed to Bosnia in 1996 under the auspices of a NATO mission. And those were the years when NATO was searching for a new direction. The Cold War was over. It wondered, what do we do now? Because Russia is supposed to be our friend now. And of course, I think they botched that opportunity greatly. but they were looking for a new mission, and that was basically to intervene in any war that they saw on the horizon, and in some cases to foment wars. And I think the aggressor here has not just been Russia in terms of invading Ukraine. NATO has been the aggressor by continuing to expand and continuing to threaten Russia with Ukrainian membership. And is this a lesson that's sinking in? Do you think? Do you think Donald Trump understands this at least? I don't think Mark Carney understands it. I don't think Pierre Poilievre understands it either. He's standing with Ukraine till the end of time. But is this something that's going to seep into our consciousness eventually?
We're gonna have to get the point, because from a military perspective, Ukraine is not going to regain the territories it has lost since 2014. I think this is a given, and more people are admitting what is an obvious fact. But just to go back to the point of the promise that was made to Gorbachev. So in 1990, it was James Baker, the Secretary of State, who promised Gorbachev with the German reunification that would be the only expansion of NATO by including East Germany, and that would be the end of it. People have been denying that this promise had been made, but authors have found the memo in the archives of the American State Department, really establishing that this promise was actually made. And you've said that you've served in Bosnia, and for Vladimir Putin and the Russian mind, this was a very, very important period of time, because the United States in 1991, they said, now our goal is not to become an hegemon. Our goal is to establish a rule-based order, and we're going to make sure that all countries in the world will respect it. Now, the problem is, in 1999, in the Balkans, NATO, without the approval of the UN Security Council, attacked Serbia in order to liberate Kosovo from the exactions that were being committed at that point of time. Thing is, the offensive was launched during Orthodox Easter, and Russia, Boris Yeltsin, at that time was president, was not warned at all by the United States that the operation would start. And Serbia, which is also an Orthodox country, is a close ally of Russia. So at that time, the Russians have realized that just maybe the Americans are saying something, but they're actually doing something completely different. So they're saying we need to abide by a rule-based order, but themselves, they're not upholding the rules that they have established. 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, it was another breach of this so-called rule-based order. And people should have paid attention in Munich in 2007, so we were talking about G.D. Vance's speech this year in Munich, but we should also recall the speech of Putin in 2007, in which he said, look, guys, just imagine the situation. Put yourself in our shoes just for a second. You have the United States, greatest military, economic, political power in this world. It is saying that we need to abide by this rule-based order, but these guys, they're not respecting it. They're doing these unilateral actions. They're not asking the approval of the UN Security Council before making these large-scale invasions of other countries. Put yourselves in our shoes. How can we believe you? You've made promises about NATO not expanding eastward, and you've done, and nonetheless, you've done it. So you're making promises, but based on facts, you are constantly breaking these promises. How can we believe you? So when they said in 2008, Georgia and Ukraine will eventually join NATO, I mean, they took it seriously. And the Russian foreign policy at that time started to shift, and it became more aggressive. But it was because of these broken promises on the part of the United States that kind of triggered everything. And now, of course, people in the Western world, this is why I'm calling the empire of good, people have come up with this idea that Vladimir Putin is as worse, if not worse, than Adolf Hitler. So he's the incarnation of absolute evil. And we, on our side, the Western world, we are the empire of good. So the Western world has fallen into this type of a religious mindset that we need to do everything to eradicate evil from this planet. So remember at the beginning of the invasion 3 years ago, people said, what were the goals at the time? It was regime change in Russia. And Bruno Le Maire, who was a French Minister of Finance, openly said, and people are mocking him now, but he openly said 3 years ago, our goal is to destroy the Russian economy so the people will overthrow Vladimir Putin. So our goal is to overthrow Vladimir Putin and have a regime change in Russia. Of course, it didn't happen. But why was it this goal? Because this goal is animated by this desire to eradicate evil from this planet. So when you're falling into this mentality, this mindset, you can only fight till the end. So I think Donald Trump is more realist, and he understands the reality on the battlefield, and he's mostly organizing his foreign policy based upon trying to do everything that will be good for the national interests of the United States. So he's more rational mindset, and he's calculating what will be good, what will be bad if I'm posing this action or that other action. This is completely different in Europe and in Canada. It's all about eradicating absolute evil. And when you are identifying Putin as the absolute evil, obviously you cannot negotiate with the devil. This is why when Donald Trump opened these negotiation talks in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, people in Canada and in Europe, they just fell from their chairs. Like, how dare he? How can he do something like that? He's negotiating with Satan. And so this is why also in Canada, Donald Trump, also with the tariff war, but it is also the reason why he's perceived so negatively by the mainstream media, by the people, because by associating himself with absolute evil, he became himself evil. And everybody who's also associated with him, such as Elon Musk, they're also targeted by people. I mean, there's a petition now, 250,000 Canadians have signed this petition so that Elon Musk would lose his Canadian citizenship. Jack Singh, leader of the NDP, wants to ban Trump from coming to Canada in June for the G7 summit. So this is a type of a completely irrational type of reaction, but it's perfectly understandable if you are into this religious mindset. You cannot negotiate with evil, and you need to do everything in your power to eradicate these type of people from Earth. And so this is why we're starting to see these two types of opposition in the Western world.
I guess that's why your book is called Willful Blindness, and I'll show that book in a minute here. But it's ironic to me that people consider Vladimir Putin the personification of evil today. He probably is a more legitimate leader than Vladimir Zelensky, who did not stand for re-election this year, who press gangs people into his army, who is suppressing the Orthodox Church in his country, who jails his political opponents, and yet that's okay. He's somehow being identified as being on the side of righteousness and good. He runs around the world in his tracksuit and his pseudo combat gear, looking like he's just been to the front, pretending to be Winston Churchill. And as far as I'm concerned, the guy has been a clown with an outstretched hand from day one. And I think people are finally beginning to wake up to the fact that this is a guy who has been salting away millions of dollars. Like Canada, for instance, I can find this. We have given $20 billion to Ukraine over the last 2 years. Another $5 billion that Justin Trudeau says we're going to find that someplace in Russian assets. And I looked it up. We don't have $5 billion in Russian assets. So Trudeau is talking nonsense. We've only spent $1.3 billion, or we're planning to spend $1.3 billion on the border, which is what we're supposed to be fixing to avoid further tariffs from Donald Trump. But is there a disconnect here? Is this money has this money actually gone to the military, or are we pouring this into what I call the black hole of Kiev?
It's falling into a black hole. I think it's the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs who has estimated, without any evidence, but this is just an estimate, that from 30% up to 50% of the money that was sent to Ukraine has disappeared. Obviously, it's never going to be recovered, and we all know why. I mean, in terms of the corruption, you look at the corruption index, Ukraine and Russia, they're basically at the same level, like in 130th position. So Ukraine it's well known. It has always been like that. In this part of the world where I'm living, this is how politics is managed. So there's really nothing different between Ukraine and Russia. The type of politics going on there is basically the same kind of the same kind of politics. And so yeah, $20 billion that Canada has given to Ukraine. Just think about it. That's a third of this year's deficit, which was 60 billion. So a third of this year's deficit is basically what was sent to Ukraine. And the thing is, we've sent everything that we were able to send in terms of military equipment. We've sent half a dozen Leopard tanks. Basically, it means these were the only ones that were actually functioning. We're sending. I mean, our military is underfunded. If there was a war today, any enemy could walk to Ottawa in just a few hours. There's nobody to defend this country, and this is something that Trump is mad about, because he's actually saying Canada is not a reliable partner. You're supposed to be defending our northern frontier. You're supposed to be protecting the Arctic, yet you're not doing it. You have Russian boats just traveling through the Northwest Passage, Chinese boats as well. There's Chinese interference in your democratic process. You're not doing anything about it. So you are not, in terms of military defense, you are not a reliable partner. So this is also the reason why he's been pressuring Canada with his tariffs, commercial war, because he actually wants us to do something more. And I think that in 2025, in the world that is shaping in front of us, we will need to do more. And hopefully, people in Ottawa will start to understand, to get the message. But I doubt that this will be the case, unfortunately.
Well, you mentioned the fact that the Leopard tanks we've given to Ukraine, and they're gone now. They've been blown up on the battlefield months ago. Those are the only ones that were functioning. And former General Andrew Leslie, who was an Ottawa area MP for the Liberals, and who was I believe the House whip for the Liberals in the first term. He would have made a very good defense minister, because here was a man who's had two grandfathers who were defense ministers. One of them was Andrew McNaughton. But Andrew Leslie has been extremely critical of our policy of just giving away equipment en masse to Ukraine, because he says we don't have any mechanism to replenish it. Like, we're out. We're not going to get any more tanks after this. We've given another 25 light armored vehicles to Ukraine in the last shipment. We're not going to see those back. They're probably already gone. And we know Ukraine is selling military equipment to cartels because they're making a buck off this. And to me, it's just so outrageous. But do you really think Russia can be expected to accept a ceasefire? And we hear Marco Rubio say every day, well, we're hoping they do. We really hope they do. Do you think they're going to do that, or even should be expected to do that, if we continue to send arms to Ukraine? Because this gives them 30 days to replenish themselves and get ready to go back on the battlefield. I don't know how they can do it, by the way. They don't have anybody left to fight of military age. They have consumed a whole generation in this war. It's like the First World War. It's a whole generation gone of young men and women in some cases. So can Russia be expected to accept a ceasefire?
There's an amazing hole in the demographic pyramid of Ukraine. So this country, unfortunately, it's basically paralyzed for the next 100 years. It has lost so many young men and so many young women who have also left the country over the past 3 years. Many of them will never come back. So at the end of this war, Ukraine will be filled with old people and individuals who will have lost their limbs, who won't be able to work for the future of this country. So regarding the 30 days ceasefire, I don't think Vladimir Putin will accept it, because he has nothing to gain from it. He's gaining territory day after day. And as you've said, he knows very well that if he's giving 30 days to the Ukrainian military to somehow reorganize itself, it will also allow its soldiers who are still in a part of the Kursk region around the city of Sudzha. It will allow them to solidify their defense, and it's simply going to be way more difficult for the Russian military in a month to kick them out of this city and push them out of Russia. So when you have to negotiate, and this is the thing, in a negotiation, for both parties to negotiate and make compromises, there needs to be a stalemate. This is what happened in 1953 in Korea. The front lines were not moving anymore. So both sides realized there's nothing to gain anymore from this war. So we need to have peace talks and we need to make compromises. This is not the case right now. Russia believes that they can keep gaining way more territory, push all the way to the Dnieper River, and maybe also at some point be able to seize Odessa. And the Ukrainians, somehow, they also feel like they can still win the war because they're hoping, and this is my biggest fear, they're hoping that at some point there's going to be a vicious circle, and at some point some European nations will send troops on the ground to fight alongside the Ukrainians. Because this is what the Ukrainians need. They don't need more money. They don't need more tanks. They need more men. They need more soldiers. And in Europe, there is a vast majority of people who are in this religious mindset. They believe that they are the empire of good. And I'm afraid that in the upcoming months or upcoming years, we may have French or Dutch or British soldiers in Ukraine fighting alongside the Ukrainians. So this is what I've said at the Rebel News. European leaders are walking like sleepwalkers, slowly but surely, towards an open war with Russia. So, and a 30-day ceasefire. So this is amazingly complicated because you need people who are going to be able to keep an eye on the line of demarcation between the two sides. You're going to need a neutral arbitrator who is going to be able to assess if both sides are actually respecting the terms of the ceasefire. This is amazingly difficult. And why do something so complicated for something that will last only 30 days? So when we're talking about the situation where both sides genuinely think that they can win the war, it kind of reminds me the situation in Vietnam in 1968. Lyndon Johnson in 1968 started negotiation talks with North Vietnam, and it took 5 years for the Paris Peace Treaty to actually be signed in 1973. So people who think that this war could be settled in a month from now, I think they're dreaming. In terms of negotiation, if the Ukrainians are not accepting that they have lost the war, and if the Ukrainian nation wants to have a future, that they need to end this war right now. If they're unable to accept the hard fact, if they're unable to accept reality, this war will keep dragging on and on and on for many, many months, and still for a few years. So, and I think this is giving Donald Trump the perfect excuse in a month from now to just say, look, guys, I know I've promised during the campaign that I would stop this war in 24 hours or in 100 days. You are witnesses. I've done everything that I could. I've hosted at the White House Macron, Keir Starmer, even Zelensky. I've opened talks with Russia. I spoke with Putin. I've sent Marco Rubio in Riyadh to meet with Lavrov. I've sent one of my closest friends, Stephen Witkoff, to speak directly, to go to Moscow to speak directly with Vladimir Putin. I have tried everything, but you can witness the whole thing. These guys, they don't want to end this war. They want to keep on fighting. So we're out. So I'm sorry, I'm unable to respect my promise, but I've tried everything to make it happen, to stop this war. But it's obvious that it's not going to happen, and it's not my fault. They are to be blamed. So we could very well see in a few weeks from now, the United States really, really withdrawing completely from the war and withdrawing from any sorts of peace talks. And this would mean also the end of Starlink and the internet in Ukraine. And that's also the end of the United States providing intelligence information to the Ukrainian military. I'm sorry for Ukraine, but it's obvious it's a lost battle.
But of course, if Europe decides to insert itself into that vacuum, that means NATO becomes a player in this war. And by default, the United States will be involved in this war unless it withdraws from NATO, which I think is a very real possibility within the 6 months. But right now, the United States is still the foundation of NATO. And if NATO becomes involved in this war, we Canada becomes
Canada will
involved
be
in this
involved.
war, and we've already become perilously close to nuclear war with Ukraine shooting British and American missiles into Russia. I'm surprised Putin did not retaliate at that point. But the longer this war goes on, I think the closer we come to the catastrophe of nuclear confrontation. And that's why I want to see this war close. But I think what you're saying is entirely correct. This could be just put on the back burner, but putting this war on the back burner increases, I believe, the chance that it escalates because of European interference into a nuclear confrontation.
And many people are always using that argument. If we negotiate with Putin, it's back to 1938, negotiating the Munich agreement with Hitler. I'm saying what I have to say about this comparison, which doesn't make any sense. In 1938, France and Great Britain, they had a choice. If they would have wanted to stop Hitler to invade Germany, they would have been able to do it. They had the upper hand. They had the strongest military forces at the time, but they didn't have the political will, which is why Churchill said, "You've chose peace and dishonor, and you will have dishonor and war." So they had the choice. Now we need to have a look at the situation, be realistic. Do we have an alternative other than requiring a ceasefire and a peace agreement in Ukraine? Even if we wanted to do something to keep helping Ukraine, that's simply not an option. We need to face reality. It's not a matter of we have an option to keep fighting and hopefully being able to win the war because we have the upper hand against Russia. We just don't. The only way to have a upper hand against Russia is to use nuclear weapons, which is simply not an option. So the comparison with the Munich agreement doesn't make any sense because the political option, the alternative is simply not there. We need to face reality because if this war keeps dragging on, Ukraine will lose more and more men and will keep losing more and more territory. So actually, the peace treaty should have been signed in the summer of 2022 when this is what Mark Milley, the former US chief of staff, this is what he said in an interview. This is the time that Ukraine, because they had the momentum, this is the time that they should have been asking for a peace treaty, because from a military perspective, in his case, it was clear for him that Ukraine would not be able to regain more territory. So he suggested them, you need to take advantage of that. You are the momentum at the moment, and you need to be able to use it and dictate the terms for a ceasefire. But the U.S. administration said this is not an option. We need to keep on fighting. And 2 years later, we just see the catastrophe that we're now facing.
Well, I don't understand why nuclear war was unthinkable in 1962, throughout the 1980s, throughout the whole Cold War. It was unthinkable. We were told that. Nobody wins in a nuclear war. It's going to mean hundreds of millions of people slaughtered. And now we have European leaders thinking about, well, we could possibly have a nuclear war, and maybe we won't definitely lose the whole civilization, but it's madness. And I think this is why we need to fight to get this war stopped, because it brings us to the brink of nuclear war. But my final question for you, and I wanted to make sure I got this in today, is that you made a comment about the rare earth minerals. And of course, it's interesting that Ukraine made a deal with the UK. And this has been not pointed out by very many people, but they made this quiet little deal with the UK to give the UK rare earth minerals. And it's on Keir Starmer's website. I looked it up, and I'm sure you have too.
Still there.
And yet they're still talking about giving these rare earth minerals to the United States. I mean, what kind of a game are they playing? I think you said you had some intelligence on this matter when you spoke to Rebel.
Yeah, so it's coming from a Czech newspaper that had the information from leaks from Ukrainian intelligence. They came up with this story about 10 days ago. And they said when Zelensky met Starmer in January, when they signed this 1-year partnership, 100-year partnership on January 16, so 4 days only before Trump came back to the White House, this is apparently when Zelensky promised to Great Britain that British interests would have access to the strategic resources of Ukraine. And now today I've also seen reports that apparently it also promised Great Britain control of 6 harbors in the region of Odessa to Great Britain. So maybe, just maybe, this is also the reason why Trump doesn't see any interest in maybe pursuing negotiations because he actually knows that he's not going to win anything out of a peace deal if indeed these resources have been promised to Great Britain. And this also explains why Great Britain is actually leading the charge in Europe for Ukraine to keep on fighting, because they have a vested interest. They want Ukraine to win the war and regain the territories in the Donbass region, because that would also allow the British interests in the future to also have access to these resources. So this is, in a way, this is pure hypocrisy, because the empire of good, France, Great Britain, they're saying, we're in this fight for democracy. It's a matter of principle. We need to fight absolute evil. But in reality, they're like the United States. It's just they're not assuming it, but they're also in there for their national interests and hoping that they'll be able to benefit from the natural resources of Ukraine when the war will end. So we also need to be aware of that, and it's kind of unfortunate because these types of discussions are not happening on mainstream media. Just like me, you can see that the experts on TV, it's all about like moral questions. Like, it's a matter of principle. Vladimir Putin is evil, and we need to fight him because otherwise we're gonna have he's gonna invade Poland and the Baltic states like Hitler did with the rest of Europe in 1939, 1940. So it's just and just trying to put some perspective into this conflict. Automatically, people who are doing that are all immediately identified as secret agents of the KGB, people paid by the Kremlin, basically traitors to the Western world. And this is unfortunately the outcome of when you have a religious mindset. You're simply unable to accept that there's a gray zone. It's not that everything is either black or white. But in a religious mindset, everything is black or white, and you cannot accept any gray zones, any alternative discussions. And this is unfortunately the reality in which we are. And this type of reality can only lead to disaster. So the current situation is kind of reminding me the summer of 1914. People are just having this imagining that war can be a great odyssey, and the soldiers can go on the battlefield with flowers and the cannons of their guns, and they'll be back for Christmas to celebrate with us. There's this kind of romantic idea right now that of war, and you're talking about like maybe we should think about using nuclear weapons, or France could also serve as the new nuclear shield for Europe, now that the United States seems to have withdrawn from the defense of the European continent. Emmanuel Macron on TV a few days ago had this martial type of rhetoric that we are at war, and you have some of his advisors. They're trying to figure out ways to finance the war effort to basically engage France into a war economy. When you look at this from the outside, it's absolutely crazy.
So, well, this has been a very invigorating discussion. I sense you're not quite as optimistic as perhaps we could be about this war ending. You mentioned Vietnam taking 5 years, and a lot of people forget that. It was the end of that war started under Lyndon Johnson, finally ended under Richard Nixon, and they had Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State at that time, who was, I think, probably a fairly formidable force when it came to negotiation. But I'm not optimistic either. Yeah, and it took 5 years. So, but I think if more people listen to you and people like Professor Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Sachs, of course, who's out there talking about this, we might have some hope to end this war. But how can people access your work and your book, Doctor?
So I've published in 2024 a book entitled Putin's War and the Reshaping of the World Order with Palgrave Springer. So it's available online. I'm actually trying to I'm discussing Russia's foreign policy as this also this civilizational aspect, because people don't actually know, but in the Russian mindset, Russian people are considering Moscow as the third Rome, the third and last Rome. So they consider Russia as a civilization in itself, and they consider Russia as the last defender of the Christian world. And if you read closely the speeches of Vladimir Putin since he came back to power in 2012, so starting from 2011, you tend to see that this is this notion, this civilizational aspect in his discourses is more and more and more present. So this is why I've analyzed in this little book, which is available online. It's been published by Springer and Palgrave Macmillan.
I really, really appreciate that, Professor, and hope to have you back again to talk about this when perhaps we have better news to report about this war. But it's been a pleasure, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. And we'll be, of course, watching. I know you will be too, watching the induction today. And there's your book. I knew we had a slide somewhere here for it. Yes, we will have the description of your. You will have the book listed in our description, where you can get it and why you should read this book, because this is a very important work, and this discourse needs to be part of the narrative today, and unfortunately it's being completely ignored by the mainstream media. So thank you, Professor Caron, for joining me today, and Godspeed. That was Professor Jean-François Caron, and we spoke to us from Kazakhstan today, and really appreciate him being there. Bit of a rush today because we're going to a live event at 11 at Rideau Hall. Yes, Mark Carney is being, yes, buy Professor Caron's book for your MP. They need to read this. They need to know the truth about Ukraine. But at 11 o'clock, we're going live to Rideau Hall, where Mark Carney is being inducted, shall we say, sworn in, shall we say, installed as China's man, as installed as Canada's 24th Prime Minister. Interesting to see what he says. He could be calling an election within days. But where is he going? Europe. As Scott Moe, Premier Scott Moe said, what the heck is he going to Europe for when we need to negotiate with Americans and the Chinese about the tariffs? So that's what's going on here. So we're going to be going live in about 15 minutes or so. So join us again. And history is on the march right now. And history is moving at a rapid pace, and it's difficult to stay abreast of events, but we're trying to do that. So thank you for watching this section of Stand on Guard today. We'll be back very shortly. Hopefully, there will be some major news in the next couple of perhaps hours or days about where this country is going. We need an election now. Oh, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I don't hear that very often. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. Continue to resolve to resist. Let's continue to do what we need to do to fight for free speech and for justice and for freedom in this country. And I'm glad so many of you enjoyed Professor Caron. It was a pleasure to talk to him. And we will be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you for joining me today. And bye for now.